There's a recording made in April of 1961 at Carnegie Hall in New York City. A woman walks out onto the stage in a tuxedo-style jacket and black tights, and the audience responds before she has sung a single note. Not polite applause, something closer to relief, as if several thousand people had been holding their breath for years and only now been given permission to exhale. She was 38 years old. She had already been declared washed up more than once by the industry that made her. She had survived more than most people accumulate in 2 full lifetimes. And when she opened her mouth and sang, the room did something that concert halls rarely do. It surrendered completely. That recording, the Judy Garland show live at Carnegie Hall, would go on to win 5 Grammy Awards and be called one of the greatest live albums ever made. It would become the document of a comeback so improbable, it felt like something scripted. But the thing about Judy Garland's life is that the comeback was never the end of the story. The crash always followed. Always. This is not a story about talent. Everyone who ever saw her perform already knew about the talent. It was obvious, immediate, and undeniable in the way that only the rarest kind of ability ever is. This is about what happens when the machinery of an industry gets hold of a child before that child has any defenses, and what it costs her over the next 3.5 decades. It is about a woman who spent her entire life trying to recover from her own childhood. Most people know Judy Garland, the icon. Very few know Frances Gumm, the girl from Minnesota who was handed to Hollywood before she understood what she was handing over in return. Part 7. Born performing, never given a choice. Frances Ethel Gumm came into the world on June 10, 1922, in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, the youngest of 3 daughters born to Frank and Ethel Gumm. The family was in the entertainment business in the modest regional sense of the word. Frank managed a movie theater and performed. Ethel played piano and performed. The 2 older girls, Mary Jane and Dorothy Virginia, performed. By the time Frances arrived, performing was simply what the Gumm family did, and the assumption was that the youngest would join the tradition as naturally as learning to walk. She was 2 years old the first time she went on stage. The story varies slightly in the telling depending on the source, but the essential shape of it is consistent. The baby climbed onto the stage at her father's theater, grabbed a microphone and sang. The audience responded with something between delight and astonishment, and something was set in motion that night that would never fully stop. There are people who are born with a capacity for performance that is genuinely different in kind, not just degree, from what most people can do. Frances Gumm was one of those people. Her voice at 3, 4, 5 years old was already notable in a way that people who heard it remembered. There was a quality to it that didn't quite fit the body it was coming from, a depth and a resonance and a kind of emotional accuracy that children that age simply don't usually have. It was a gift in the truest sense, and like many gifts of that magnitude, it came without a manual for how to carry it safely. Ethel Gumm is one of the most complicated figures in the story of Judy Garland, and any honest telling of it has to sit with that complexity without reducing her to a simple villain, though the temptation is understandable. She was ambitious for her daughters in the way that the era and the culture made available to women of her circumstances. She could not pursue a stage career herself, not in the way she wanted, but she could push her daughters toward it, manage their bookings, handle their costumes, accompany them on the piano, and make herself indispensable to their advancement. Frances, who had the most conspicuous talent of the 3, became the primary focus. Ethel's ambition transferred onto her youngest daughter with a force that the daughter spent her whole life trying to process. It was not simply that Ethel pushed, it was the specific quality of how she pushed. She was relentless and she was present and she could be genuinely encouraging, and then in the next moment genuinely devastating in a way that made the ground beneath Frances perpetually uncertain. Praise from Ethel was real, but it was conditional. conditional on performance, on effort, on pleasing audiences, on being what the act required. What Frances might have wanted on a given afternoon, what she might have needed in terms of rest or play or the ordinary accumulating experience of being a child, was not the primary concern. The act was the primary concern. The Gum Sisters, as the act was initially billed, performed wherever they could get bookings: vaudeville theaters, small venues, the regional circuit of the early 1930s that was already beginning to feel the pressure of radio and sound film. They traveled, they rehearsed, they performed. Frances, despite being the youngest, quickly became the center of the act. Audiences heard her voice, and she became the reason people stayed. By the time she was 10 or 11, the calculus was clear even to her. She was the one with the gift. She was the one Ethel was building everything around. That kind of centrality is a complicated thing for a child. It provides attention, approval, a sense of purpose. It also removes the ordinary permission to be ordinary, to have bad days without consequence, to be less than excellent without everything falling apart. She was not allowed to be average. Average was not what the act needed. In 1934, the family relocated to Los Angeles, drawn by the gravitational pull of Hollywood, which was, by then, the center of the entertainment universe. Frances was 12. The Gum Sisters continued to perform, and through connections and auditions, and the particular persistence of Ethel, the family eventually made contact with the talent machinery of the major studios. It was at one of these performances that the entertainer George Jessel suggested the act rename themselves for practical reasons. Gum was unfortunate as a stage name. What they settled on was Garland, and for her own first name, Frances chose Judy, after a popular song of the time. Frances Ethel Gum became Judy Garland at around the age of 12. It was a small, practical decision made in the ordinary chaos of a performing family's working life. But there is something in it worth noting: the name she was born with, the name that belonged to the child who had climbed onto a stage in Minnesota before she had any idea what she was getting into. That name was gone. What replaced it was a name designed for performance, for marquees, for audiences. A stage name is supposed to be something you put on and take off. For Judy Garland, the stage name was what the industry invested in, promoted, constructed a persona around, and eventually consumed. Whether Frances ever fully existed separately from it is a question that doesn't have a comfortable answer. Part 6: The Studio, the Pills, and the Making of a Star. MGM signed Judy Garland in September 1935. She was 13 years old. The contract was with Louis B. Mayer, the head of the most powerful studio in Hollywood, a man who understood talent with the precision of someone who had been buying and selling it for decades. He recognized what Garland had immediately. What he also recognized was that she did not look like the studio's preferred image of a young female star. She was not the conventional, prettily groomed type that the major studios had been packaging and selling since the silent era. She was short, she was not conventionally glamorous, and she had a quality of emotional rawness that was both her greatest asset and, in the studio's calculation, a problem to be managed. The management of Judy Garland at MGM is one of the most documented and disturbing cases of institutional control of a child performer that the entertainment industry has ever produced. She was put on a strict diet almost immediately, told that she needed to control her weight, and then given amphetamines to suppress her appetite and keep her energy high during the long shooting days. She was also given barbiturates at night to help her sleep when the stimulants made rest impossible. She was 13. The people giving her these substances were adults in positions of professional authority over her, acting with the studio's sanction, presenting it as ordinary practice. It was not ordinary. It was the systematic chemical manipulation of a child's developing body and brain in service of a production schedule. Garland later spoke about this period with a kind of flat precision that was more disturbing than outrage would have been. She described it as simply what happened, something the studio did, something her mother cooperated with, something nobody at the time framed as wrong. The pills were the beginning of a dependency that would shape every decade of her remaining life, that would make stability always provisional and recovery always partial, and the possibility of being simply, well, always just slightly out of reach. The years before The Wizard of Oz were years of constant work. She appeared in short films and musical features, was loaned to other studios, and was gradually built into something the studio could use. She was paired frequently with Mickey Rooney in a series of musical pictures that were enormously popular. They had an easy, genuine chemistry on screen that came from the fact that they were two young performers who genuinely liked each other and who understood each other in the specific way that comes from sharing unusual circumstances. Mickey Rooney was the biggest box office star in America at the time. Judy Garland was working toward that, and the films they made together gave her a platform that steadily expanded her audience. But nothing prepared the audience, or the studio, or Judy Garland herself for what happened in 1939. The Wizard of Oz was not considered a certain success when it was made. It was expensive, ambitious, and the kind of production where the possibility of disaster was genuinely present throughout. Garland had actually not been the first choice for the role of Dorothy. The studio had attempted to borrow Shirley Temple from 20th Century Fox and been declined. Garland, 17 and playing a 12-year-old, got the role partly by default. What she did with it was not partly anything. Her performance of Somewhere Over the Rainbow, the song that Harold Arlen and E.Y. Harburg had written, and that the studio almost cut from the film for pacing reasons, became one of the defining moments in the history of cinema. Not because of the technical excellence of the singing, though that was evident, because of what she put into it. That ache, that genuine longing, that sense of someone reaching for something they can barely name. That was not performed. That came from somewhere real in her, from the specific experience of being a child who had been performing her entire life and had somewhere underneath it a hunger for something simpler and more ordinary than anything her circumstances were going to allow. The audiences felt it. They always felt it with Garland, and The Wizard of Oz was the moment it became impossible to miss. She was an international star at 17. The studio responded to this by working her harder. The schedule in the years following The Wizard of Oz was relentless. Film after film, promotion after promotion, the constant machine of publicity and production and public appearance that studios of the era managed with totalizing efficiency. She was not consulted about what she wanted. She was managed, directed, scheduled. Her opinions about roles were received politely and then generally ignored. Her health was not a priority. Her continuation as a productive asset was. The pills continued. The pressure continued. The weight monitoring continued, along with the particular cruelty of studio executives commenting on her body with the casual authority of people who owned property. She began to show the cracks, missed days, erratic behavior, the specific instability that comes from a nervous system that has been chemically interfered with since early adolescence, and a person who has never been permitted to develop the ordinary architecture of a stable interior life. In 1950, MGM fired her. She was 27 years old. She had been at the studio since she was 13. She had made 33 films for them. She had been a reliable source of enormous revenue, and they let her go without, by most accounts, a great deal of ceremony. Part 5. What falls apart after the machine lets go. The years immediately following her departure from MGM were the years in which it became clear how completely the studio system had shaped Judy Garland, and how entirely unprepared she was to exist outside of it. The system had controlled everything: her schedule, her diet, her medications, her public image, her professional decisions. It had been confining and damaging and exploitative. It had also been, in a terrible way, structuring. It had given her a reason to get up, a place to be, a defined function. Without it, she was a 27-year-old woman with severe drug dependency, a disrupted marriage, significant debt, and an identity that had been built entirely around performing rather than around being a person. The marriages are worth addressing because they tell a particular story. Judy Garland married 5 times. David Rose, the musician and composer, in 1941. They divorced in 1945. Vincente Minnelli, the director, in 1945. Liza Minnelli was born in 1946. They divorced in 1951. Sid Luft, the producer and manager, in 1952. Lorna and Joey Luft were born in 1952 and 1955. They divorced in 1965 after a particularly prolonged and difficult separation. Mark Herron, an actor, in 1965. They separated almost immediately and divorced in 1967. Mickey Deans, a nightclub manager, in 1969, the year she died. 5 marriages in 28 years. The pattern is not difficult to read once you understand the context. Garland was someone who had never, from earliest childhood, been taught to be alone or to find stability within herself. She had always been performing, always been managed, always been oriented toward an audience or an authority or a relationship for her sense of ground. When one source of structure collapsed, she moved toward another. The men she chose were not, with the possible exception of Vincente Minnelli, chosen primarily for compatibility. They were chosen for the function they could serve in a life that was always threatening to fall apart. She needed people who would manage things, handle the logistics, provide the scaffolding that she didn't know how to build for herself. What she often got instead were men with their own complicated agendas, who were drawn to her fame and her talent, and who were not equipped for the actual reality of her. Because the actual reality of her was genuinely demanding. Not in the way of a difficult personality, though she could be that. In the way of a person whose childhood had left gaps that no adult relationship was ever going to fully fill, whose dependency on substances made her volatile and unreliable in ways she genuinely could not always control, and whose talent was so large that it created a particular kind of isolation. Nobody around her could fully enter the experience of being Judy Garland. The children complicate the picture in the way that children always do when the adults around them are struggling. Liza Minnelli, the eldest, inherited her mother's musical gifts and went on to a career of her own that would eventually produce its own iconic moments. She was close to her mother and also frightened by her, both things simultaneously in the way that children of troubled parents often are. She understood early that the stability of her household was contingent on Judy's condition on any given day, which is an enormous thing for a child to carry. Lorna and Joey Luft grew up in the later and harder years, when Judy's condition was more chronically precarious and the household less predictable. Lorna has spoken in later years with careful honesty about what those years were like, the love present and the chaos present, and the way the two things existed side by side in a manner that made simple summary impossible. Judy Garland loved her children. That is not in question. Whether she had the internal resources to be consistently what they needed is a different question, and the honest answer is complicated by everything the studio had taken from her before she was old enough to know she was giving it away. There were suicide attempts, several of them across the decades, beginning in the early 1950s. They were not always, by the accounts of people close to her, straightforwardly intentional in the way that the clinical definition of the phrase requires. They were sometimes the desperate expression of someone who had reached the point of intolerable pain and did not have any tools for managing it, other than the chemicals she had been given to manage herself with since childhood, taken in quantities that exceeded what was safe. The distinction matters and also doesn't matter. What matters is that she was a person in profound recurring distress who did not receive the kind of sustained, structured care that might have addressed the roots of it, because that kind of care was barely conceptualized in the 1950s. For anyone, and certainly not for a woman whose earning potential was the primary lens through which the industry regarded her. People kept finding her useful. That was the problem, and also the occasional solution. Part 4. The stage that saved her and the business that didn't. The Carnegie Hall concert in 1961 did not come from nowhere, but it came from far enough back that the distance looked like a miracle from a certain angle. The years preceding it had been genuinely terrible by almost any measure. Multiple hospitalizations, the collapse of a CBS television series, financial ruin of a scope that is difficult to comprehend given the scale of the money that had passed through her hands over the previous 2 decades. She had earned enormous sums and had almost nothing to show for it financially. Managers, lawyers, husbands, and her own chronic inability to sustain the kind of stable working life that accumulates savings rather than debts had left her essentially broke. She owed the Internal Revenue Service significant back taxes. She owed other creditors. The machinery of debt that surrounded her by the late 1950s was staggering. Against this backdrop, Sid Luft organized the Carnegie Hall engagement. It was a calculated gamble on the premise that the audience for Judy Garland had not evaporated, but simply been waiting. He was right. The concert sold out. The audience that night was not simply a general music-going public. It was an audience that contained an enormous number of people for whom Judy Garland represented something deeply personal. She was, by 1961, already a figure of particular significance to communities of people who understood what it meant to feel like they didn't fit, who had grown up being told that what they were wasn't acceptable, and who heard in her voice something that named an experience of longing and survival that they recognized. She did not perform for 2 hours. She performed for 2.5 hours. She kept going because the audience kept responding, and because being on a stage in front of people who loved her was, by all evidence, the place where Judy Garland felt most coherently herself. The pills didn't stop her there. The exhaustion didn't stop her. The weight of everything that had brought her to that stage didn't stop her. She sang. The album that resulted sold hundreds of thousands of copies and won Grammy Awards and introduced her to a new generation of listeners who had been too young to see her at MGM. It was a genuine, significant, commercially successful comeback. And then the pattern that had always defined her life reasserted itself, because the pattern was internal, not external, and a successful concert cannot fix what is broken in a person at the root. The television series that followed in 1963 and 1964 is an instructive case study in the distance between a person's talent and their ability to harness it reliably under industrial conditions. CBS gave her a primetime variety show, The Judy Garland Show, which should by rights have been a substantial and sustained success. She was in extraordinary voice during many of the episodes. The guests were major figures. The production was strong, and the show was canceled after 1 season, partly for reasons of rating strategy, partly because Garland's unpredictability behind the scenes had become a genuine production problem. She was not always on time. She was not always in stable enough condition to work. The gap between who she was on a stage in front of an audience and who she was in the hours before getting there had always been enormous. The stage transformed her. The approach to the stage was often chaos. The late 1960s were the final chapter, and they are hard to read. She was in her 40s, and she looked and sounded older than her years in a way that was specifically the result of decades of pharmaceutical stress on her body. Her voice, which had been one of the great instruments of the 20th century, was no longer reliable. She performed in London in 1968, and the reviews were painful. Not all of them. She still had nights when something came through that reminded audiences of everything she had been. But those nights were surrounded by more that revealed what the years had done. She married Mickey Deans, her fifth and final husband, in March of 1969. She was 46. He was 35. The marriage was brief and by accounts disorganized. She was performing to pay debts, accepting engagements she was not well enough to sustain, living in London in circumstances that were precarious in nearly every dimension. On the morning of June 22, 1969, Mickey Deans found her in the bathroom of their rented cottage in the Chelsea neighborhood of London. She was 47 years old. The coroner's inquest determined that she had died of an accidental barbiturate overdose, noting specifically that the level in her system was such that her body, weakened by years of dependency, had reached a threshold it could not survive. The word accidental was not a euphemism in this case. It reflected a genuine finding that she had not intentionally taken a lethal dose. She had taken what she had been taking for years, and what had always been too much had finally been too much. She had been doing this since she was 13. Part 3. Who Judy Garland actually was. The difficulty with reconstructing Judy Garland as a person, rather than as a cultural symbol, is that the symbol accumulated so much weight over so many decades that the person underneath it requires genuine excavation. She has been so thoroughly transformed into an icon of survival and vulnerability and camp and tragedy that the actual woman, Frances Gumm from Grand Rapids, Minnesota, who loved to perform and was funny and sharp and terrified and brave in the same breath, can get lost inside the mythology. People who knew her well described someone of genuine warmth and considerable wit, who was also exhaustingly unreliable and capable of deep generosity and sudden irrational cruelty, depending on the day and the substances and the level of fear she was managing at any given moment. The fear was constant. What she was afraid of varied, but the underlying thing was consistent. She was afraid that without the performance, she would be nothing. She had been taught this so early and so thoroughly that it had become indistinguishable from what she actually believed about herself. The performing had begun before she had any sense of an interior life that was separate from what audiences wanted from her. And the result was a person who was genuinely uncertain at the deepest level whether she existed as anything other than a function. This is not a metaphor or a loose psychological formulation. It was how people who loved her described the problem. She would be in a room and she would be brilliant, funny, present, lit up with the specific electricity that made her extraordinary on stage. And then she would ask whether you really meant the compliment you had just paid her. And the need for reassurance in the question was so raw and so genuine that it was almost unbearable to encounter. She needed to be told, not occasionally, but constantly and seriously, in a way that no finite number of reassurances could satisfy, because the problem was not a deficit of praise. The problem was that she didn't have a stable internal structure that could hold and integrate the praise once it arrived. The studio had built her into a star before she had built herself into a person, and the star was what survived, vivid and extraordinary, while the person underneath remained unfinished. She was funny in a way that people who only know her from her films don't always fully understand. The humor was dry and self-aware and capable of genuine darkness in the way that the best humor often is. She made jokes about her own notoriety and her own disasters with a precision that suggested she saw herself clearly enough when the mood was right. She could be devastatingly perceptive about other people, about the entertainment industry, about the particular absurdities of the world she had been living in since childhood. This intelligence and self-awareness made the trajectory of her life even harder to watch from the outside, because she was not a person without insight. She knew, at various points, exactly what was happening to her. Knowing did not change it, which is one of the things that addiction does to a person, and which Garland's circumstances illustrated with particular clarity over 4 decades. Her relationship with her audience was unlike almost anything else in the history of popular entertainment. She did not simply perform for audiences, she communicated with them in a way that felt profoundly mutual. When she stood on a stage and sang, the audience did not experience the polished distance of a star delivering a product. They experienced something that felt like contact, like someone who had survived things and was singing about surviving them, and who needed the audience to confirm that survival in a way that was entirely authentic. The audience felt needed, and they responded accordingly. At Carnegie Hall in 1961, at concerts in London and New York and across America over 3 decades, she produced something in audiences that very few performers have ever produced. A feeling of being met. Not dazzled, not impressed, though both of those too. Met. She was also, it should be said, enormously professionally accomplished in ways that the tragedy narrative can obscure. The technical mastery of her voice, her timing, her physical presence on a stage, her ability to use the microphone as an instrument of intimacy rather than simply amplification. These were not gifts she simply possessed. They were skills she had developed over decades of work starting when she was 2 years old. She was a serious professional whose craft was built on thousands of hours of performing under conditions that ranged from ideal to genuinely awful. Even in the last years, when her voice was diminished and her stamina unreliable, the technique was still visible in what remained, the architecture of what she had built. Part 2. The world she left behind. When Judy Garland died in June of 1969, the world had been watching her for more than 30 years, which meant that the grief that followed was the particular kind that attaches to people who have been public figures for long enough that their lives feel in some way shared. She was buried in New York. 22,000 people came to view the body over 2 days, a number that was extraordinary, even for someone of her stature. The crowd stretched around the block in Manhattan in the summer heat. People who had grown up with her films, who had heard her voice on the radio, who had been in movie theaters in 1939 when a 17-year-old stood in front of a painted sky and wished for somewhere better, and who had been waiting for her to be okay in the way that people wait for the ending of a story that seems like it should resolve. It never resolved. The grief was for what she had been, and also for the specific way her life had gone. Nobody watching her in The Wizard of Oz at the age of 17, hearing that voice on that song, could have predicted with any certainty that this was where it would end. There is always, with Garland, the sense of what should have been different. The things the studio did to her, the childhood that was taken and replaced with performance, the pills given to a child by adults who should have protected her. The anger that the story produces in people who learn its full details is real, and it is appropriate. What MGM did to Judy Garland would, if conducted under current professional and medical standards, be considered child abuse without significant ambiguity. The systematic administration of controlled substances to a minor to regulate her body and her schedule for the studio's convenience. The monitoring and shaming of her physical appearance beginning in early adolescence. The construction of a professional persona around a child who had no way of consenting to what that persona would cost her. None of this was unusual by the standards of the time, and none of that context makes it less than what it was. Liza Minnelli carried her mother's legacy into a career that was, at its peak, extraordinary in its own right. She won an Academy Award for Cabaret in 1972, 3 years after her mother's death, and a Tony, Emmy, and Grammy at various points in a career that spanned decades. She has spoken about her mother many times over the years, sometimes in ways that are clearly processing something that does not resolve, something that remains present and active in her even now. The love is obvious. So is the weight of it. Lorna and Joey Luft have spoken about their mother in interviews over the decades with a similar quality of unfinished grief. They were children when she died, relatively young, and they have spent their adult lives in the shadow of a story that was not theirs to write. The Garland legacy in the broader cultural sense has been enormous and complicated. She became, over the decades following her death, an increasingly complex cultural figure. The Wizard of Oz has been seen by more people in the history of television than almost any other film. Somewhere Over the Rainbow has been covered and reimagined and referenced so many times that it has become something close to a common vocabulary, a shorthand for a certain quality of hope that knows how much distance separates it from where it started. The songs she sang, the performances she gave, the recordings she left behind, continue to reach people in the specific way that only the rarest performers ever achieve. They don't age in the way that most popular entertainment ages. They remain present, immediate, capable of producing in a listener the same recognition they produced in the first audiences who heard them. That is the gift, still intact, still doing what it always did. The tragedy is what surrounds it. The question that remains uncomfortable, that people who care about Garland tend to return to, is one of responsibility. Not just the studios, though that is clear. Not just Ethel Gums, though that requires its own reckoning. The industry's collective willingness to use people of extraordinary talent without regard for what that use costs them. The cultural appetite for spectacle that turns a child into a symbol before she has become a person, and then expresses sorrow when the symbol is unable to survive the weight of itself. Judy Garland was consumed by an industry and by an audience and by the machinery of celebrity, and she was aware enough at various points in her life to say so clearly. She said it in interviews with humor and with bitterness, and with the particular combination of the two that defined her public voice at its most honest. She said it and kept performing anyway, because performing was the one place where the panic was replaced by something that felt like being real. Part 1. What was lost, and what the voice carried. Frances Gumm did not choose to be Judy Garland. The choice, to the extent anyone made it, was made by Ethel, ratified by MGM, and cemented by audiences who needed what her voice gave them before she had any real understanding of what it would cost. She was 2 years old on a stage in Minnesota. She was 13 when a studio started managing her chemistry. She was 17 when the whole world heard her sing about wishing she were somewhere else, and the world heard in it something true about itself, and she became property. The flying in the Alexander Onassis story had a quality of freedom to it, of something chosen for its own sake against the opposition of people who wanted to own the person doing the choosing. Judy Garland had a version of that too, though hers was less legible from the outside, because the thing she loved was the same thing she had been exploited through. She loved to sing, she loved to perform. Not in the complicated, ambivalent way that people sometimes love things that have hurt them, but genuinely, at the level of the thing itself. When she was on a stage with a microphone and an audience, something in her organized itself into a clarity that was not available to her anywhere else. She was not performing in those moments in the sense of pretending to be something she wasn't. She was performing in the sense of becoming most fully herself. The cruelty of her story is that the thing she loved was the thing the industry had used against her from the beginning. It makes the love feel contaminated in retrospect, inseparable from the exploitation. But those who knew her and who watched her on good nights said it wasn't contaminated, that what came out of her on a stage was something that preceded the studio and survived it, and that the genuine love of the work was still visible in her, even at the end, even when the voice was not what it had been, even in the last difficult years when the ground was always unstable. She had been becoming her own person in the years after MGM, in the complicated way that people become their own persons when they're starting from a position of profound damage. The Carnegie Hall years showed a version of her that had made it through something enormous and had something to say about having done so. She had children she loved. She had people around her who genuinely cared for her. She had a talent that was still capable of producing moments of extraordinary beauty when the conditions were right. She was also drowning in debt and dependency and the accumulated cost of 4 decades of a life that had been structured around her utility to other people. She was 47 when she died, which is young by any ordinary measure, but 47 after a life that started at 2 on a stage in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, is a different kind of 47 than most people experience. She had lived a very long time measured in performances. What she had not lived was a life in which she was primarily a person rather than primarily an instrument. There is a particular category of loss that belongs to people who die without having been fully protected. Children who are handed to industries before they can protect themselves. Talents that are extracted and monetized before the person housing them has any say in the terms. Judy Garland belongs in that category in a way that is specific and important. The loss is not simply a tragedy in the generic sense. It is the loss that comes from a system working exactly as it was designed to. A system that identified extraordinary value in a small child and organized itself to extract that value as efficiently as possible over as long a period as possible, without sufficient concern for whether what it was extracting from was also a human being, with needs and limits and rights. She sang about going somewhere over the rainbow for most of her life, a place where the dreams you dare to dream really do come true. She sang it first at 17, with a longing so genuine it became part of the permanent emotional vocabulary of the 20th century. She sang it for the last time somewhere in the final difficult months of 1968 in London, in circumstances that were precarious and sad. The longing never left the voice. That was what people heard in her until the very end, the specific quality of someone who had not given up on the somewhere else, who still believed in it even when the evidence was overwhelmingly against it, who kept reaching for it even when the distance between where she was and where she wanted to be had never narrowed as much as it should have. Frances Ethel Gum from Grand Rapids, Minnesota, who became Judy Garland at 12 and gave the world more than it had any right to ask of her, was buried in June of 1969. Her voice is still here. The longing is still in it. And the question her life asks about what we take from people who can give us extraordinary things, and whether we are ever careful enough about the cost,